In 2019, the US ended the World Trade Organization's dispute resolution mechanism, and it hasn't been fixed since. So how can we restore some kind of binding mechanism to resolve international trade disputes, and what are the hurdles that get in the way? Hello Chad, welcome, nice to see you again.
Thanks for having me.
Now Chad, our story today starts in 2019. The US effectively ends the WTO's dispute resolution mechanism on its own. How on earth did it manage to do that?
Well, it turns out that any country could have done it. It just took the United States to do it. So what they did effectively was to block the appointment of new judges, or in the WTO speak, these are called members of the WTO's appellate body. This is the appeals court. And without a quorum of judges there, any rulings that are issued in sort of the first stage of the dispute settlement process can be appealed essentially into the void. And so the dispute resolution process stops. And then recognizing this, countries stop, pursuing disputes when they have trade frictions. So in effect, any country could have done this, but the United States decided to be the one to end the system.
Why did it do it, though?
Well, there were a number of reasons. I think one, obviously, was the Trump administration and their particular views. The U.S. trade representative under President Trump, this man named Robert Lighthizer, was a longtime critic of the WTO and the dispute settlement process, dating back to the 1990s when it was first started. But more broadly, there has been a general concern in the United States with a set of rulings that the WTO has made over the last 20 years. And this isn't just a President Trump thing or a Lighthizer thing. This was really a bipartisan concern. And I think this is why you haven't seen the new administration, the Biden administration, overturn things. These were rulings about certain types of import restrictions, things called trade remedies, that went against the United States.
Tell me, what exactly are these trade remedies? I think in the Europe we call them trade defense instruments, don't we?
Yeah, so these are exceptions to the WTO. So the WTO says, countries should in general have relatively low tariffs. Countries come in, they negotiate and agree to limit their general tariffs, not impose them higher than some level. But they're also granted exceptions. Under exceptional circumstances, they're allowed to impose special kinds of tariffs if products, if your domestic industry is injured, and then the imports that are causing that injury are either dumped, so they come in at a price that's too low, or the foreign competition is receiving subsidies, or sometimes even if there's just too much of the imports coming in at all. The WTO grants its members, the United States, all other countries, access to special tariffs to be able to use to deal with those exceptional circumstances.
That's the ideal. That's the way that it's meant to work. In practice, I guess there must have been something wrong with this. How far did the use of these instruments stray from that ideal?
As economists, we have a hard time understanding what the ideal would be. We sort of recognize that it makes sense for there to be some flexibility, some exceptions written into the agreement. But really, I think you're trying to achieve a balance. You don't want to make the conditions too easy to access, or that just makes the general, commitments that countries take on when they join the WTO to keep their tariffs low. It makes those meaningless. But if you make the access too tight and say, countries, you can't ever utilize these exceptions, well, that then kind of pushes things in the wrong direction. What we can say is when I looked at the data, it's about maybe 3% or so of imports, at least of the G20. So these are the major economies out there in the world. About 3% of their imports or so are now covered by these trade remedies, trade defense instruments. But whether that's too high or too low, it's hard to say.
Now, we don't have this system of adjudication anymore. I would have thought when it got shut down that everyone would have been running around, banging off the walls, saying, we have to have this fixed now. But it's a couple of years later and we're all still here. How much urgency is there in the WTO to fix this?
Well, I think it depends on who you talk to. So I think if you are thinking about the bigger countries, and so this is the United States, China, European Union, they're big enough. They can throw their weight around. They have power where not having access to a functioning dispute settlement system probably isn't the end of the world for them. Now, that to be fair, the Europeans especially have really clamored to try to fix this thing, but the United States has really not signaled all that much interest in doing so yet. But if you're a small country and you really are reliant on the rule of law to sort of generate the predictability that your companies and workers need to have access to foreign markets, then this really does, I think, have the potential to really, really hurt you. And so we've seen those kind of countries clamoring to affix to the system, but the big guys, especially the United States, so far aren't there.
As I remember, the core of all of this was the US taking exception in particular to the way China did business, its economic exceptionalism. That would have to be addressed, I guess. What precisely is the problem here? What is its impact on trade?
That's exactly right. And it turns out this is not even just a U.S. only phenomenon. So you now have, 50 WTO members or so that use these trade remedies. 50. So that's a lot. It's not just the United States. What virtually all of them have in common is they're using these things to restrict imports from China. So the biggest foreign target of all of their use, not all, but mostly all of their use of trade remedies is imports coming in from China. But the reason for that is as yet still unclear. We know the Chinese economic system is very, very different from that of the US, UK, Europe, and all the market economies of the world. But what it is that's worrisome about the Chinese system that would cause us to want to develop new rules for using trade remedies, I think is still to be determined and hasn't yet been settled.
Well, let's think about how we might fix this. Is one possible way to fix it to write some more specific rules on how trade is done? Because I think you've mentioned this before, that there is always a certain vagueness in trade agreements.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think that's the approach that is the dominant approach being considered right now. And some of that's not surprising. Trade negotiators are typically lawyers, and oftentimes, the legal approach to something is, well, let's try to figure out how we can write a more precise rule to deal with this problem. I think the challenge when it comes to thinking about China is whether that's going to work. The Chinese system is very different than that of the Western economies. And every time we try to write a new rule, maybe their system might evolve, end up satisfying that new rule, fine legally, but the economic implications really aren't being changed at all. And that, I think, is one of the concerns with just trying to think that you can write new rules to deal with the challenges posed by China.
Always the problem with regulation, isn't it? So maybe the WTO could change direction a little bit and think more about managing trade and have a system, say, of granting market access. Would that work?
Well, I think that's another option. So if we go back to thinking, what is the WTO really for? Why do countries sign up to this thing? What economists have argued is one of the major reasons why countries find the WTO valuable is it allows for countries to exchange market access, to say, I'll give you access to my import market if you do the same thing for me. And what that ends up doing is it creates a system that allows for countries to kind of stop imposing externalities, extra costs on their trading partners of their policies. And I think that's probably a useful way to think about the China challenge, the China problem. What is it about China that we're really worried about? Well, we're worried when China does things that impose costs on us that, it's not taking into consideration. If what we're most concerned about is not necessarily the Chinese economic system, let them do their own thing, have their own system of subsidies and state-owned enterprises, what we're really worried about is when they do that in a way that imposes costs on us, well, let's focus on the costs. And if we can think about focusing on the cost by instead stressing access to their market for U.S., European, foreign exports, and also China's access to our markets through imports. So just focusing on the market access piece, maybe that's an alternative way to approach this that wouldn't require us writing defining, monitoring, ever precise rules on subsidies.
What would you do if you were in charge of this, Chad? How would you fix it? Also, I want to know, what's the best that you hope for out of this, and the worst that you fear as well?
Well, I haven't yet settled on what approach I think is the right one. And I think but more broadly, economists out there, this is what we need to be contributing to the debate. There's going to be costs and benefits of alternative approaches, and maybe the right thing to do is to have a hybrid approach that would have some elements of each. But I think the problem right now is that the negotiators out there are sort of talking past each other. They're not sure what it is that they ought to be negotiating over. They're not really sure what is it about China's system, if you're one of the Western negotiators, that's problematic. And I think that is where economists can help out and where we can contribute. So the point of my new paper is not necessarily to resolve this problem. It's to try to reframe the debate, to clarify what the issues are, and also to potentially, call out to economists out there that we should be ones that are helping to contribute answers to the needs that policymakers today have when they're wrestling with these kinds of issues.
Well, we're coming into a particularly perilous time for the global economy, aren't we? So let's hope that this can be sorted out. One thing I am pretty sure about is we will be talking about this again, Chad, but thank you very much for today.
Thanks for having me, Tim.
Two of Chad's papers will help you get the full story on this. From 2020, DP 14477, Why Trump Shot the Sheriffs, the end of WTO Dispute Settlement 1.0, and more recently, DP 16935, Trump Ended WTO Dispute Settlement, Trade Remedies Are Needed to Fix It. Remember, Chad is also the host of the second best economics podcast, and that's Trade Talk, so check that out as well. Well, thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.